My name is M.E. Solomon, and I'll be reading an excerpt from my flash fiction story titled Mother. The smell of fried potatoes coming from the kitchen wakes me. They have that off smell again. I don't get out of bed because I don't feel like going into the kitchen and starting up a chat with Mother. Instead, I read the news of the day right there in the paper Mother left by my bed, like she does every morning. The headlines, the obituaries, and always the crime section, the cold case murders. Occasionally, there's the name of somebody I know in there, a missing person, for instance. Well, the story Mother is about a daughter's conflicted reaction and attempts to piece together and her eventual acceptance of a thing that she can't change, which in this case is her mother's strange behavior. I developed the narrative suspense by pulling from points in time in the evolution of the narrator's perception and then interlacing it with thoughts and actions from the present and recent past of the narrator. I also carefully thought about when to reveal information versus when to withhold information, and then gradually let out information slowly to sort of stretch the elastic a little. I also interlaced references to the strangeness that's going on in the house, and then immediately tie it back to a kind of a seemingly related memory from long ago in the narrator's life, such as, for instance, the reference to missing persons in the crime section of the newspaper. So she mentions it, and then immediately describes a memory from childhood when she and her sister, this is not in the excerpt, but it's later in the story, she describes a memory from childhood when she and her sister, quote unquote, could have gone missing once. So that paragraph in turn leads to another memory, and each paragraph carries a thread from the last paragraph until it reaches the end, kind of like a rubber band that gets too taut and then eventually breaks. So that creates the suspense in this story. Okay, this story went through a variety of drafts, as many as 12, before landing on this more sparse, bare bones version. The way I create suspense in my work is an ongoing and kind of iterative process, and much of it, like many writers, I run it by my readers, and I work with my writing coach, who's from a service for writers called Write by Night. But ultimately, my education in creating suspense in my own work really is organic in the sense that it comes from tuning in very closely to what strikes the right chord. It comes from my own aesthetic. It comes from what personally appeals to me, the stories that, really strike the chord in me that creates the kind of emotive response that I'm looking for and that I hope to engender in my readers. And then, of course, how I want to translate that into my fiction. Well, I would say a good way to explore narrative suspense, especially when you're writing in the first person, is to just look at it from a variety of different angles or write out a variety of scenes from different angles or different perspectives of the narrator to get a sense of what's working and what isn't. And then, of course, to run that by other people and see how they're taking it, what's working for other readers and what isn't. Also, the element of surprise, of course, such as interrupting the storytelling with a small, relevant detail that kind of has a surprise to the reader that kind of interrupts the story a little bit, but then returns to it immediately. So anything that creates really an understated or even an unstated sense of dread is going to be more powerful than one that's closer to the surface. So later in the story, when the narrator says, I almost called out to her, when she's referring to her mother, and she says, quote, I almost called out to her and said, Mother, what are you doing now in the middle of the night? I didn't, though, unquote. It calls up an unstated fear or suspicion on the part of the narrator that something is dreadfully wrong, but the narrator deliberately pushes it out of her mind. Why? Because it's become necessary for her to do so in order to continue caring for her increasingly deteriorating mother. And that leaves, a lot of the unspoken. It creates a sense of dread in what's not revealed. So I have to say one of my favorite short stories is a story called August Heat by W.F. Harvey. It's from the early 20th century, and it's about a man who is tied to an encounter that he happens upon one day that builds to a terrifying chaos. A terrifying climax. It's a fantastic story. It's not that long, and called August Heat. The build toward the final scene is very slow, and the reader just doesn't anticipate the end. It's a fantastic story. There's also a movie from a few years back called The Boy that has a very suspenseful pacing to it, where all along the viewer's held in place by one narrative, and then partway through there's a sudden shift that jumps out at you as really largely unanticipated. So both of these stories, one being a written story and the other a visual one, have that quality of kind of moving along at a steady pace that you know is going to blow open at some point. And of course, therein lies the tension, which then creates the feeling of suspense in the reader and in the story. Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that. So in this story, the withholding of information creates suspense and tension. The distinctions between narrative suspense and narrative tension, as I see it, are like one is sort of a subcategory of the other. So I think the way I see it, you can have tension without suspense, but not really suspense without tension. You find suspense in a number of genres, of course, like thrillers, detective stories, anything where information is kind of pulled from the reader or the viewer, if it's a visual. Narrative horror, I think, is designed to obviously scare. Narrative horror specifically is designed to scare the viewer, of course. In this story, much of the suspense comes from what isn't revealed, as I mentioned. So toward the end of the story, there's the narrator saying, "Well, I shook my head. I went back to bed. I knew I'd have to clean up the next morning," which he missed, and it leaves the reader searching for an image of what might have to be cleaned up in the morning. So you find this a lot in classic Gothic writers like Mary Shelley and Poe and Hawthorne, and even in more modern stories like Shirley Jackson, We've Always Lived in the Castle. So, in a thriller, the story is told at a fast pace. In a detective story, you're solving a puzzle. In narrative horror, you're really watching from a distance, kind of a remove. And there's this internal scream, kind of a silent scream going on that's ultimately the reader's response to the horror that's playing out before them. So that's how I see narrative horror in fiction. Absolutely, I'd love to give shout-outs. I'd love to shout out to the publications who published my work throughout 2020. Teleport Magazine, the periodical Forlorn, who published a short story, Ample Remains, who published Mother, the story that we're talking about here, and then Patty McCarthy and Christopher Clausen over at Breaking Rules Publishing, who published the story of mine called Boxcar, as well as Perpetual Motion Press, who shortlisted one of my stories just this year in 2021. So shout outs to those guys. And it was a pleasure talking with you.